Please stand with me for the reading of God's word. This is Psalm 36. Transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes. For he flatters himself in his own eyes that his iniquity cannot be found out and hated. The word of his mouth are trouble and deceit. He has ceased to act wisely and do good. He plots trouble while on his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not reject evil. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. Man and beast you save, O Lord. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. Oh, continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright of heart. Let not the foot of arrogance come upon me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. There the evildoers lie fallen. They are thrust down, unable to rise. This is the word of the Lord.
All right, well, good morning. It's good to be with you. My name is Josh. I'm the lead pastor here at Sojourn, and I haven't preached in 2-3 weeks. Pretty exciting. So I don't know if you're excited or less excited to have me back up here, but here we go. We are continuing our summer series. We call it Psalms in the Summer. We look at 10 Psalms each summer. We're looking at 31 through 40 this year. And so we're on Psalm 36 this morning. And as I was thinking about this psalm and how to kind of introduce it to you, my mind was drawn to something I've shared with you guys before, but not everyone's heard it. We'll get that figured out in a minute, hopefully. But maybe, 15 years ago, I'm dating myself a little bit, TV and movies started moving in kind of this different direction, where we had what we now call the rise of the anti-hero, okay? And so historically, if you think about stories that you read or watched, movies, TV shows, okay, you have a main character. That main character is typically called the hero, and the hero is a good guy, right? The hero is someone that you pull for, you like, you cheer for. And you can feel good about it when they win at the end because it's like this person embodies what's good. And obviously we see ourselves in the hero, and we like to think of ourselves as being really good people that if we were in that spot, other people could cheer for us. And about 15, 20 years ago, TV started kind of to move in a different direction. And that was best exemplified with the shows Breaking Bad and Mad Men, where you had the two leading characters, Walter White and Don Draper, who were what we now call anti-heroes, because they were the main characters, they were the heroes of the story, but they were terrible people, right? They were terrible guys. And as fascinating as those shows were, and many of us have watched them, you felt icky the whole time you watched it, right? Because you're just like, I can't really, you're terrible. You're a terrible person. And the show writers and creators kind of presented them to us in a way that it's like, I don't know if I'm supposed to cheer for you or hate you or both, because they would have good moments, but they'd have terrible moments. And it was just really, really conflicting. And if you ever listen to any interviews with the people who created those shows, they would say, one of the things we're trying to draw out is that this is real life, right? This is what life is really like. There is no such thing as this really good, noble, altruistic person. We're all really conflicted. We're a mixed bag. We're kind of good and evil together. And I think as Christians, or I won't speak for all of us, I'll speak for me. As a Christian, I always feel really conflicted with that, right? Because on the one hand, I believe that all of kind of those fairy tale stories, right, they ultimately point to the story, right? And that there's something in us that wants to see our hero who's truly good, rise up, vanquish evil, because that's the story of God. And yet, on the other hand, I also think that if those are the only stories we entertain, because we see ourselves as the hero all the time, we can start to think way more highly of ourselves than we ought to. And I think the rise of the anti-hero is a little bit of it's a little bit of a curb against our innate desire and kind of our innate sense of just kind of seeing ourselves as better than we really are. And when we see those conflicted characters, I think it's a reminder that we're conflicted, right? That there's evil inside of us as well because of sin. And I mention all of that just to say that that's kind of what we see here in Psalm 36. Psalm 36, you can really kind of split it into two parts pretty easily. Verses 1 to 4, David is doing this reflection on evil, this reflection on the wicked, and how it is that a wicked person kind of thinks, how it is that a wicked person kind of internally processes and justifies their actions. And then, starting in verse 5, he moves into a clear comparison and contrast with God and how God is and how God is not like that. And kind of all throughout, as we get to the Lord, it starts right there in verse 5. David's actually going to mention it 3 times. I think the dominant theme in this psalm is the steadfast love of the Lord. We've actually seen that a number of times in this series. Here it is again for us this morning. And so then, as we kind of move through this text this morning, I want to point out kind of 3 points or 3 ideas. You can almost say there are 3 headings that I think will help us make sense of this psalm. We're going to see a picture of wickedness, a contrast with God, and a cry for help. Okay, so first of all, a picture of wickedness. When I preach, I don't often bring up translation. I don't often bring up the original languages. If you don't know, the Bible was not originally written in English. It's written in Old Testament Hebrew and a little bit of Aramaic, and then the New Testament Greek. And we are incredibly blessed to have not just the Bible in print form, that we can all have our own personal copies or digital form on our phones. But we're incredibly blessed, I think, to have many wonderful English translations that, for the most part, you can know, like, this is God's word, and you don't really need to worry about translation issues and wondering, am I really reading like what God originally wrote? For the most part, we're good. That said, I obviously said that because today I want to talk about translation for just a moment, because the ESV, which is the English Standard Version, which is what we preach out of here at Sojourn, I think they actually got this wrong. I think they got verse 1 wrong. And the reason why is because there's a phrase right at the beginning that they omit. They don't include it. And I was not on the ESV translation committee, so I don't know why they omitted it, okay? I'd actually, if I talked to one of the people who was on it, I'd love to ask them. But I actually think there are other translations that get this better because they include it. And so I'm going to read from the CSB, which is the Christian Standard Bible. And I think we should have that up on the screen for us here. Here's 36:1 from the CSB. An oracle within my heart concerning the transgression of the wicked person. Dread of God has no effect on him. And then when you look at the ESV, you can see that that first part, an oracle within my heart, they don't include that. And it just goes right to transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. Now, at the end of the day, either way, I don't think the meaning is lost. We know we're talking about how the wicked thinks, okay? But the reason that I bring it up, and I bring it up in the CSB, is that, as you guys know, when you read through the Psalms, and we've talked about this a lot, David talks a lot about his enemies, and he talks a lot about evil, and oftentimes it's the evil out there, okay? Last week, we looked at Psalm 35. Eric did a great job with that, and he argued, I think rightfully, that Psalm 35 is about Saul. Okay, and that David is talking about Saul as his enemy. And that makes sense because Saul was a great enemy of David for many, many years. And so I think a lot of the Psalms where David's talking about his enemies, he's probably talking about Saul. So I think Psalm 35 fits with that. And because of that, I think it would be very natural for us to think that in Psalm 36, David is also talking about Saul, or he's talking about some other wicked person. But when we include that first line, an oracle within my heart concerning the transgression of the wicked person. I think Psalm 36 is better understood as David, rather than looking outside and saying, look at that wicked person. I think it's better understood as David saying, in my own heart, I feel this pull towards wickedness. In my own heart, I feel these temptations. And when I do, this is kind of my thought process. I think that's a better way to understand Psalm 36. We know that David was kind of the original anti-hero, right? There was a guy who, he did a lot of amazing things, and he did a lot of really terrible things. And then as we read David in the Bible, it's conflicting, right? It's conflicting. It's like, how should I feel about David? I think at the end of the day, we feel good about him because Jesus is in the line of David, and David's called a man after God's own heart. And so it's like, yeah, David, okay. But then, it's like, yeah, but, he did the Bathsheba thing. And he did, he did some other things, and it's like, it's not great, right? Skip that part in Sunday school, okay? We don't put that in the children's curriculum. But right, we know, a little dicey there. And so then I absolutely think David, he had some real serious sins in his life. He knew what it was to experience temptation and to succumb to temptation. And I think David is giving us his internal thought process. So this picture of wickedness, rather than being, the wicked out there, I think it's the wicked inside. So I think that's the right way to understand this. As David gives us this picture, he gives us three parts, okay? The first part we see is that there's no fear of God. There's no fear of God. That what is it that tempts the wicked or leads the wicked down this road of giving into sin? Well, it starts with there's no fear of God. So we'll jump back to ESV now. Verse 1, transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes. Okay? And the idea that David wants us to see, he picks it up in verse 2, for he flatters himself in his own eyes that his iniquity cannot be found out and hated. In other words, the lack of a fear of God leads the wicked to think that they'll get away with it, that they won't be found out, that they can do this thing and no one, they know if people knew, they would hate it, right? He says it there in verse 2, this iniquity cannot be found out and hated. So it's clearly, hey, this is wrong, it's not good. And they're not even pretending to think that it's a good thing. They're like, hey, if people knew this about me, if they knew that this was my plan, nobody would like it. But nobody's going to find out. Now, I'm not going to get caught. No one's going to know either that I did this or that I was the person behind this. It was kind of my plan, my brainchild. Nobody's going to find that out. And it all starts with a lack of fear of God, right? That no person's going to find out. And whether they don't fear God because they don't believe that he exists or they don't fear him because they don't think he's powerful or whatever, it leads to this. And I think it's interesting that, if we go over one book into the Proverbs, David's son Solomon is going to write that wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord, right? That the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And David here is kind of taking the other end of the spectrum, so to speak, and saying, if wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord, sin begins with not fearing the Lord. In other words, David is kind of putting together, you either are going to fear the Lord and be wise, or you're going to not fear him and be foolish and move into and give into the temptations that he's talking about here. So there's no fear of God. I mentioned probably David's most famous sinful action with Bathsheba, and you think about what goes on there, okay, that David begins with an illicit relationship with another man's wife, and then he tries to cover it up, right? He brings Uriah back. Uriah's in battle. He brings him back because Bathsheba is pregnant because of David, and Uriah comes back, and so David says, well, I need Uriah to think that the child is his, and so I'm going to bring him back. He'll go be with his wife, and then, the timeline will get pretty close to matching up, and he'll think, oh, okay, this is my child. And Uriah, is so noble and so loyal that he won't even go see his wife, that he literally sleeps on the palace steps. David even tries to get him drunk, if you remember, to get him to go back home, and he won't do it. And so David ultimately sends Uriah back to the battle with his own death sentence in his hand, right? With the words to say, send Uriah to the front line and then retreat and leave him there so that he will be killed. That's not good. And you think about, well, what led David to do all that? And I think David's telling us right here. He's thinking, I thought I wouldn't get found out. I thought that because I was the king, nobody would know. I thought that I could get rid of Uriah, make it look like it was part of battle, and then I'll take Bathsheba to be my wife, and she'll come in, and people think we had the kid through that, and I'll cover it all up, and I'll fix it all. And David almost got away with it, right? Except for God. God reveals to Nathan, no, and Nathan confronts him. And so I think David is giving us the inside scoop and just saying, hey, that's how I thought. I thought I was going to get away with it. I thought because I was the king, nobody would know. No fear of God. So that's one piece. So we're thinking about this picture of wickedness, this portrait of wickedness is one piece, no fear of God. Another piece is deceitful words. Look at verse 3. The words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. He has ceased to act wisely and do good. So another kind of piece of this puzzle, the temptation towards wickedness, is that we use our words rather than to bring people into truth and clarity. We use our words to deceive. We use our words to hide. Certainly that's what David was doing. We use our words to muddy the water, right? To make the truth obscure and to make it so that even if the truth is out there, no one has any way of knowing that that's what the truth is, because there's so much unknown out there. There's so many alternative viewpoints or alternative truths that it's just we throw our hands up and say, well, how can we even know? And I would say this, that when we look around at our current day, right, this thing, deceitful words, I would say is like page 1 of the playbook when you're accused of something wrong. I mean, I know I bag on our political leaders a lot, but they deserve it. Like we're in a moment right now where if you're a famous person and you get accused of something wrong, okay, I could tell you, I'm about to tell you how people respond, but you could tell me. We all know how people respond, okay? A statement is released through a lawyer, all right? And you know what the statement says. I am not guilty of what I've been accused of. I didn't do it. There was a misunderstanding, okay? And what's the purpose of that? The purpose of that is to muddy the waters. The purpose of that, maybe someone's innocent, I don't know, and they're speaking the truth. But the purpose of that is to say, our best play is for people to not be able to know the truth. That's our best play. And so we're just going to deny, and we're going to deny forever, okay? And when enough leaders do that over a long enough time, eventually you get to where I think we are as a society, which is either we don't know or we don't care or both, right? We stop caring about the truth, or we just decide the truth is unknowable, so here we are, okay? We're in a moment where the two most likely presidential candidates are accused of incredibly not great crimes, right? You guys know this. We can be honest this morning. And you know what they're doing? They're denying, and they're denying forever. And the truth is, I don't know if they're guilty, and you don't know if they're guilty, and unfortunately, we're probably never going to know. Like, that's the sad thing. But what I see here in the text, and I see it play out in our culture all the time, is that people want to deceive. That nobody wants to find the truth. People want to deceive. They want to use their words to muddy the water and not find the truth. And David's saying, hey, that's page 1 out of the playbook of the wicked. You know, right, when you're being tempted to evil, you want to deceive people, and you don't want the truth to get out. So that's kind of piece 2 of this picture. So there's no fear of God. We use our words to deceive. And then I think the last thing David wants us to know is that sin is deeply rooted in our hearts. That when we're moving down this progression, that kind of the last phase is that it's deep in our souls. It's not just a mistake. It's not a one-time thing. It's not just, that's not who I normally am. Well, that's another thing people say. I made a mistake. That's not who I really am. And I always say, no, that is who you are, right? You're a sinner. You're depraved. That's the way life works. and we see this here. Verse 4, he says, he plots trouble while on his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not reject evil. So we talked before about how the Psalms, they're poetry. Okay, so you get a lot of metaphor, euphemism. And we have it here. He plots trouble while on his bed. And I think the idea that David's getting at, he certainly probably means that this person's literally lying in bed, maybe before they go to sleep, and they're thinking about, hey, tomorrow, how am I going to deceive people? How am I going to continue the lie? How am I going to continue the story, the narrative that's out there so that I don't get caught, so that I don't get found out? All right, so I think that's one thing, but I think because it's just poetry, it's even more than that. If you think about your bed, right, you think about your bedroom, okay? Your bedroom is the most intimate room of your house, okay? So when you have people over, typically, unless they're really close, right, you close the door to your bedroom, right? You're not like normally letting people into your bedroom. And if you were going to let people in, maybe you're doing a tour of the house or whatever, you're probably going to say, hey, can I just run in my bedroom real quick before you go in, right? I need to check and make sure that it's presentable, right? That's the word we use, presentable. And we all know what we mean by that, right? Because there are just things in our bedroom that we don't typically want anyone else to see, except our spouse, maybe, if we're married. And so we just, it's intimate, it's private, it's like separate. And then, can you imagine, like, if maybe you're doing the house tour and you open your bedroom and you say, here it is, and everybody's commenting, and then someone just runs and hops on the bed and goes, man, this is comfy. This is great. Man, what mattress is this? This is awesome. Like, you'd be weirded out, right? You'd be like, that's my bed. That's my pillow. Those are my sheets. Great. Laundry for me. Thank you for that. It would be weird, right? It would be weird. We just wouldn't do that. Why? Because it's intimate. There's something about our bed that's like sacred. It's like, that's my bed. Like, it's not for you. And I think when David says he plots trouble while on his bed, I think he's saying in his most intimate thoughts, in this person's most private thinking, the place that even if they let you into their house, and even if they let you into their room, they've cleaned it up so that you couldn't know what's really happening, right? Even there, they're plotting trouble. Even there, all the way, it's totally saturated them. In Christian theology, we refer to this as total depravity, okay? Total depravity, meaning not that we're as bad as we could be, but that we are totally depraved. All of us, our thoughts, our emotions, our mind, our bodies, it's all been corrupted by sin. There is no part of us that has been untouched by sin and its effects. And I think that's the idea that David has here. So you put all that together, so we get this picture of wickedness. There's no fear of God. We use our words to deceive, and then it saturates us such that sin is deeply rooted in our hearts. And so, I think what David's trying to say is, hey, if you ever wonder, like, how does that happen? How do we get to the place where we started at A and now we're down at Z, and it's like, how did we get there? I think he's just giving us a window into the soul and saying, well, this is how it happens. We think we're going to get away with it. We start to cover it up, and before long, it's all we can think about, right? It has totally consumed us. So that is this picture of wickedness. The next thing we need to see is the contrast with God. So now in verse 5, as David has established, hey, this is what it looks like to be wicked. Now he says, but God, right? But God is not like that. He is totally different. And the idea, I think, is that David just says, hey, we need to contrast that with who God is. And I mentioned in the introduction this dominant theme of the steadfast love of the Lord. And so David, I think, is going to mention several attributes of God, the scriptures about him, and we'll look at those. He begins with God's love, his love. And there's a few things that David says about God's love. The most dominant one is that it's steadfast. So verse 5, your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens. Then you look at verse 7, how precious is your steadfast love, O God. And then verse 10, continue your steadfast love to those who know you. So David, this is a pretty short psalm, right? Only 12 verses. And we get three 3 repetitions there, which lets us know this is really important. This is the dominant idea David wants you to know. He wants you to know that God's love is steadfast, that it's unchanging, okay? It is unwavering, okay? His love is steadfast. We'll come back to that idea. Another idea about God's love that David wants us to know is that it's immeasurable, that we cannot know how great God's love is. He says it there in verse 5. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. So David wants us to see that we cannot know. The Apostle Paul will say in the New Testament, how high, how deep, how wide, right? How vast are the riches of the depths of God's love. No one can know. It's unfathomable to us. We cannot measure it. We cannot comprehend the love of God. It is beyond anything that we have ever known or experienced as a human being. So it's immeasurable. Another idea that David wants us to see is that it's precious. Look at verse 7. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. I think David is now moving again into the realm of intimacy here, right? Something that's precious. And David is saying, God, not only is your love steadfast, right? It doesn't change. Not only is it immeasurable, but it's precious. How precious to me is your love, your steadfast love. And then one more thing David wants us to see is that it's safe, that God's love is a safe place. The second part of verse 7, the children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. Okay, they take refuge there because it's safe. It's safe to take refuge in the love of God. Because that is the dominant thing, we're going to come back to it. But there's a couple other things that I want us to see. Another thing that David gives us is that God is trustworthy. Okay, we've talked about this a lot in this series, so I'm not going to camp out here. But just to make sure we see what the text says here. Verse 6, he moves into the character of God. And he says, your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. And so David says, hey, not only is God loving, but he's also righteous, okay? He is not like the anti-hero. He is holy. He's righteous, okay? His character is absolutely pristine, and it does not change. It's like the mountains, meaning it cannot be moved, okay? When you look up at a mountain, you go, wow, look at that. If I were to go over and to try to move or shape or change the mountain in some way, it's not going to happen. It's not going to work, okay? It's just there to kind of behold and be in awe of. And he says that is like the righteousness of the Lord. And then he says your judgments are like the great deep. So again, as we've seen throughout this series, David is reflecting on the justice of God, and it all kind of fits together, right? His moral perfection, that he's righteous and he is just. And man, I was thinking about where he says, your judgments are like the great deep. So we're thinking about water, okay? And it's interesting, last night we were watching the Apple TV screensavers. You guys know what I'm talking about? And we saw one of, it's underwater and it's a kelp forest. Some of you guys have seen this, okay? And Esther and I were talking, and we were just noting how that's really creepy, okay? Like being underwater is like, it's a weird thing. Some of you might like it. I don't know, maybe we have professional scuba divers in here. But we were talking about our experiences like snorkeling, and she's gone scuba diving before. We were just talking about how we don't like it, okay? Because there's this weird feeling when you're underwater. It's not just that you're dependent on oxygen in a tank, but like you're just surrounded by the unknown. You can't see very far. You don't see very clearly. And a shark could come at any moment, all right? And it's just this like, ugh, okay? And I brought up, I was like, anytime you read Bible commentaries about the water, the first thing that they'll say is like, well, people in Bible times were really scared of the water. It was unknown. And I'm like, in Bible times they were scared of the water? Now we know it's in the water. All the more reason to be afraid, right? And I'm not a fearful person. But it's wild. It's wild under the water. And I think as David says, your judgments are like the great deep, I don't think he means be afraid, but I do think he means there's a mystery to it. There's an unknown to it where we're not going to fully perceive the judgments of God, the justice of God. Like we know, and David's affirming this, we know he's good, we know he's righteous, he's holy, we can trust him, but we don't fully understand. And we're not going to fully understand because he is beyond us. He's like the depths of the ocean. We know a lot, but there's more. There's always more, and we're never going to fully know. So David wants us to see that God is trustworthy. And then the last thing, as he's given us this contrast with God, is he wants us to see God is generous. Look at verse 8. So he's talking about, the second part of verse 7, he's mentioned the children of mankind, take refuge in the shadow of your wings. And so the they is referring to the children of mankind. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. And so David, again, this is all, I think, a reflection on the steadfast love of the Lord. And he's saying, he's already described God's love, and then he says you can trust him, right? He is good, and he's generous. That he has unlimited resources, and with those resources, he chooses to let his people feast at his table. They feast on the abundance of your house, that you let them drink from the river of life. We have some callbacks to the Garden of Eden and to eternity future as we think about the river of life. Really incredible stuff that David is getting into here as you're thinking about the biblical story and all of that, and the steadfastness, the faithfulness of God to his people in spite of their sin and their failure. And so we see this incredible generosity. And so all of that, we put it together and we see this, David began with this picture of the wicked, and now he gives us this picture of God, and he says, man, look at the stark contrast, the incredible difference in who God is, that we can he is safe, he's trustworthy, he's good, he's generous, and all of that is kind of under the banner of his steadfast love. So we've seen this picture of the wicked. We've looked at the contrast that David gives us with God. And then the last little section of this psalm, I'm just calling it a cry for help. A cry for help. David ends in prayer. And there's two things that David asks of the Lord. The first one is in verse 10. Oh, continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright of heart. So the first thing David asks is, he says, God, would you continue to love me? Would you continue your steadfast love to me? And not just to me, because this was sung corporately, but to those who know you, to your people, your children. Would you continue your love to us? Over the last several years, as my wife and I have been involved in the amazing project of parenting, we've read several books on parenting, and she's much better at it than I am. I want to be clear about that. But we've read across the spectrum. We typically read Christians, but sometimes we'll read non-Christians or maybe people from a different perspective, and then we just read regular psychologists and therapists and all kinds of stuff. And it's interesting, like in that time, about 10 years or so now, across the board, Christian, non-Christian, pastor, therapist, psychologist, scientific researcher, everyone agrees on this kind of really basic idea about kids. And it's this, that especially young children, but even as we get older, that we're always kind of asking the same question of our parents underneath everything. And it's this: will you still love me? Will you still love me, right? If I forget to do what you told me, if you tell me to clean my room and I don't, if you say eat all your food, but I don't want to eat all my food, or you say you have to eat your vegetables, and I don't want to eat my vegetables, okay? I'm just thinking of all the things I didn't want to do as a kid, right? Or if I scream and I cry because I don't get my way, or as you get a little bit older, if I decide to go to a college that's different than the one we talked about me going to, or if I get to college and I decide I want to do a different career path than the one that we had landed on when we decided to spend all this money together, right? And on down the line. If I take your nice car out and wreck it, right? Will you still love me? Like, are you still going to love me? And I think the truth is that as we reflect on that, we know it's not just kids who ask that question, right? That we're kind of always, again, I don't think consciously, but underneath the surface, we're just kind of always asking, hey, are you still gonna love me? If I do this thing, if I do that thing, if I say this, like, are you still going to love me? And as I thought about that, and I thought about this psalm, and I just thought about David's life, right? I don't know what was going on in David's mind, but I'm sure because he was human, and just knowing what David did, I'm sure there were some times where he thought, God, do you still love me? I mean, you think about when Nathan confronted him, right? And he's like anguishing. And he knows that the child they had is going to die. That's one of the judgments God gives him. And I'm sure in those moments, David had to think, God, are you still going to love me after all this? Like, have I finally crossed the line? Have I finally done so much that there's no coming back from this? And I think that's part of what that prayer is there in verse 10, where he says, oh God, I know your love is steadfast. I know it's unchanging. I know it's not based on what I've done. It's based on who you are. I know all that. But would you just please not stop? Like, would you please continue? Would you please keep loving me the way that you have up to this point? And I think that in that, what we see is David wanting God to, like, keep him humble and not take for granted God's love. And to say, God, I know you love me, but I don't want to take it for granted. I don't want to presume it. I don't want to act like it's not a big deal. Would you continue it? That's the first thing he asks. And then the other one is explicitly about humility. Look at verse 11. He says, let not the foot of arrogance come upon me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. So David explicitly says, hey, God, would you keep me humble? Would you keep me away from arrogance? Would you keep me away from pride? And I think David is given a little tip of the cap that he didn't talk about pride explicitly when he talked about the wicked, but I think he's kind of saying, hey, underneath all that, right, pride is right there. It's right at the door. We think we're going to get away with stuff. We think we're too big to fail. We think we're too important, all that stuff. Pride's underneath all that. Verse 12, he ends with a pronouncement of just the path of the wicked. He says, there the evildoers lie fallen. They are thrust down, unable to rise. And so he kind of says, I know what the end of the path of sin is. I know what it is, right? It's death, it's destruction, and I don't want to go down that path. Keep me from that path. And so David ends with this cry that God would love him and that God would keep him humble. As we wrap up this morning, I don't know where the text has hit you this morning. It hit me in a number of different places this week. There might be some of us who we're really thinking a lot about that first part. And maybe you're really thinking about some things you've been tempted to do, some sin. Maybe you're at the beginning stage of the temptation and you're just kind of thinking about it. And you're like, I know I shouldn't do that. But you're kind of thinking about some of the justification schemes. Maybe you're a lot worse off than that. Maybe you're in the middle of it and you're in full-on deception mode. You are in cover-up mode. You are in no one's going to find out mode. I hope you're not there, but you might be there. And so I just want to plead with you, if you're thinking a lot about that first part, man, run away. Like that's the Bible's recommendation for dealing with temptation. turn and run. Like, get away from that as far as you can. And if you're in the darkness, you need to come into the light. You need to come into the light. The local church is a great way for that to happen, to get around people who can know you and love you and care about you and who will walk with you through moving through a plan of repentance and restoration and getting back. And so if that's you this morning, man, I just want to plead with you. Don't be fooled. Don't think, like David warns, that you're going to get away with it. Like, that is not going to happen. The Lord sees. He knows. Okay? So this is an opportunity to turn things around and to not entertain, to not toy around with the idea that my sin is no big deal or I'm going to get away with it or any of those thoughts. So we just want to move away from that. So I think that's one thing. Then there may be some of us who are thinking a lot more about that second part, and we're just thinking about the Lord and his love to us. And I wonder if anyone is just thinking about that question, will you still love me? Like, will God still love me? Does God still love me? You're thinking about stuff you've done. Maybe you're thinking about stuff that you've thought about doing. I don't know where you are this morning. The Lord knows. Where I want to end, a couple of thoughts here as we think about the steadfast love of the Lord. I think Jesus is everywhere in this psalm. I don't have enough time to go through all the ways we see him. It's pretty cool. But I want to give you two. Because what I think is clear is that we see God's love most clearly and I think most easily in Jesus, right? There's a reason that we take communion each week here at Sojourn. There's a reason why we come back to the gospel. And it's because I think that's just the easiest place to see God's love and to see who God really is. This prayer that David prays, verse 10, continue your steadfast love to those who know you, okay? If you're wondering, how did God answer that prayer? Did God continue his steadfast love to David? Well, if you keep reading, the answer is yes. Yes, he did. He continued his steadfast love to David all the way to fulfilling his promise that an heir of David would be on the throne forever, right? And we know that that is fulfilled in Jesus, the Son of David, who most clearly demonstrates God's steadfast love, not only to David, but to all of his people through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. So that's one thought. The other thought that I want to leave us with is in verse 9. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. So David here is picking up on a truth. He just says, hey, sin brings darkness, okay? That sin brings darkness. God brings light. Truth brings light. John chapter 1, verse 9. John writes, the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. Jesus, John tells us, is light. He is true light. And everything that we know and we see about this world, we see through his light, that he has revealed and opened our eyes to see. And so anything that we know that's true, that's good, that is beautiful, is ultimately seen through the light of Jesus. And so I pray that we would see through him this morning. Would you join me as we close in prayer? Father, we thank you for Psalm 36. And what a wonderful psalm this is as we've had the opportunity to reflect on our sin, on our depravity, and on you and who you are. God, I pray that we would not fall into the trap of thinking that we're better than we are, or thinking that's not me, or that could never happen to me. And I got to pray that we would see the warning signs clearly and to know, well, it happened to David. It could happen to me. And I pray that as we try to move away from temptation, that you would help us to see you clearly, and that as we see you and we see your light, we see Jesus, that would lead us away from the path of the wicked and would lead us towards the path of truth, your path, the path of Christ. Help us to do that through your Spirit. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. On the night that Jesus